You're listening to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. We're exploring An Introduction to Criminological Theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In this episode, we dive into feminist critiques of criminology and the gendered dimensions of crime and justice. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling a really crucial shift in how we understand crime and justice.
Absolutely, a shift initiated by feminist perspectives.
Yeah, they've come in, looked at the field, and fundamentally challenged. Well, and in many ways, transformed how we study who commit the crime, who is subjected to crime, and, how the system responds.
And our exploration today, it's specifically drawn from excerpts of Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory.
Right, particularly those chapters focusing on the gendered criminal and the emergence of feminist criminology as this really powerful theoretical force.
That's right. Our mission here is, well, pretty straightforward, but deeply insightful, I think. We want to unpack the core arguments that feminist criminology brings to the table.
And recognize it's not just one single idea, right?
Exactly. Not a single unified school of thought, but really a rich collection of diverse perspectives. And we want to understand the profound impact it's had.
Impact on what specifically?
Well, this impact ranges from reshaping how we view female criminality and victimization to, crucially, prompting a necessary and frankly long overdue rethinking of masculinity in relation to crime.
So think of this as getting a potent shortcut, maybe, to grasping a major paradigm shift within the study of criminology.
That's a good way to put it, a shortcut to a big shift.
Okay. And to give you, the listener, a kind of roadmap of where we're headed, we're going to start right at the foundation, that core feminist critique of traditional malestream theories.
The powerful argument that criminology has historically been overwhelmingly male-centered and, well, male-biased.
From there, we'll navigate the diverse landscape of different feminist viewpoints, liberal, radical, Marxist, socialist, black, postmodern, seeing what each brings to the analysis.
And then we'll dive into some of the major and sometimes pretty contentious debates that feminist work has generated.
Like what?
Well, challenging that whole notion that female emancipation directly leads to more crime, for instance, and dismantling the old idea that women are simply treated with leniency by the courts.
Okay. And we'll move into how this perspective has brought vital, often neglected issues right to the forefront.
Definitely. Like focusing attention on crimes against women, domestic violence, rape, things like that.
And finally, as you mentioned, we'll loop back to that fascinating point about masculinity, seeing how feminism hasn't just been about understanding women, but has also prompted a critical look at male criminality through the lens of masculinities.
And before we fully immerse ourselves, it's worth noting a point highlighted in the source. It kind of reflects the perspective we're exploring.
What's that?
Many feminists, when discussing those who have experienced oppression or crime, prefer the term survivor over victim.
Survivor, right? Why that specific word?
It's a deliberate linguistic choice. It's intended to suggest empowerment, resilience, and the idea of collective strength in, contesting male supremacy.
So it frames the discussion differently, with more agency.
Exactly. It helps frame the discussion with a focus on agency and overcoming, rather than solely on vulnerability.
That makes sense. Sets a different tone. And speaking of tone, let's get into that foundational critique you mentioned. The idea that traditional criminology was fundamentally male-centered.
Precisely. The source emphasizes this starting point. The core feminist critique is that traditional criminology, for most of its history, has been androcentric, focused exclusively on men. Or, as the term popularized by Daly and Chesney Lynn puts it, it's been a malestream discipline.
So, just to be clear, it's not just that they didn't study women enough, it's that the whole way they looked at things, the questions, the theories, it was all from a male perspective, assuming male experience was just normal.
Exactly that. The central weakness identified by scholars like Gilthorpe and Morris is this fundamental failure to properly understand or even acknowledge the crucial significance of gender and sex roles in shaping criminal behavior, victimization, and how the justice system actually works. It was just a massive blind spot.
Right. And for our deep dive, it's probably important to quickly distinguish the terms the source uses. Sex versus gender, they aren't the same thing here.
No, absolutely not. And the source is careful about this distinction. Feminist analysis really hinges on it. Sex refers to the biological difference, anatomical, physiological distinctions between male and female bodies.
Okay, the biology.
But gender, and this is the real focus of feminist analysis and criminology, refers to the socially constructed learned behavior.
So what society expects of men and women?
Exactly. It's about the cultural expectations, the roles assigned, the concepts of masculinity and femininity that individuals develop and perform through socialization within a particular society. Gender isn't seen as fixed and innate like biological sex is supposed to be. It's a dynamic social product. It changes across cultures and over time.
Got it. And within this framework of socially constructed gender, a really central concept for many, though maybe not all, feminist perspectives is patriarchy.
Yes, patriarchy. It's understood here as a system where males, collectively, hold superior rights, power, and privileges compared to females.
A system of male dominance, basically.
Pretty much. Different feminist strands interpret its origins and how it works differently, but for many it's seen as a fundamental organizing principle of society, deeply embedded in institutions, relationships, everything.
And what's really insightful, I think, is how feminism positions the significance of this gender power difference compared to other inequalities criminologists usually look at, like class or race.
Yeah, it really challenges the hierarchy of inequality, doesn't it? While theories like labeling theory or conflict theory definitely acknowledge power differences based on class, age, maybe race, feminist theory argues really strongly that the power differential between men and women, rooted in patriarchy, is at least as important.
Or maybe even more important.
Potentially, yes. More important than those other factors in explaining crime and justice outcomes.
So that's a direct challenge to something like, say, traditional Marxist theory, which would put class and economics right at the top.
Absolutely. Marxism sees class as the fundamental division. But from a feminist perspective, patriarchy is seen as equally, or sometimes even more, dominant than class in shaping social structures, power dynamics, experiences of oppression.
So you can't understand one without the other.
They'd argue you can't, really. You can't fully grasp class oppression without understanding gender oppression, and vice versa. They're intertwined.
And this theoretical difference, it has real-world consequences, right? Especially when we look at the criminal justice system.
Oh, definitely. Feminist theories propose that the decisions and operations within the CJS, how police act, how courts handle cases, what prisons are like, they aren't neutral. They reflect this underlying male dominance.
And they end up supporting patriarchy.
Often, yes. Whether it's deliberate or not, they function to support patriarchy, discriminate against women, and reinforce traditional, often restrictive, sex and family roles. We see these arguments made really powerfully by scholars like Mann, Messerschmitt, Morris, Chesney-Lind. It takes the critique from abstract theory right into the practical application of justice.
That makes total sense. And it explains why feminists felt just adding a chapter on women in crime wasn't nearly enough. The whole structure needed questioning. But you mentioned earlier that feminism isn't a single idea. The source is really clear on this.
It is, and this is so crucial to grasp. When we talk about feminism, we are absolutely not talking about one single unified theoretical system with one set of answers. It's a collection of different theoretical perspectives, and sometimes they're even in tension with each other.
So each perspective offers a different lens, a distinct way of explaining why women face oppression.
Exactly. And the logical consequence of that is that there isn't one single, universally agreed upon feminist explanation for, say, female criminality or why women are victimized in certain ways.
Different feminisms will point to different things.
Right. Different feminist strands will highlight different factors. Maybe economic exploitation, maybe patriarchal control, maybe the intersection of race, class, and gender as the primary drivers or constraints on women's lives and their relationship to crime.
And maybe that diversity within feminism is part of why a term like survivor resonates. It speaks to a shared experience of facing systemic issues, a collective resistance, but still allows for different individual paths and analyses.
That's a really insightful way to connect it. The goal of contesting male supremacy might be shared, but the understanding of its roots and the strategies for dismantling it, they vary significantly among the different feminist perspectives.
And if we look at the history, it's often talked about in waves, right?
Yes. The source talks about the first wave, mainly late 19th, early 20th century.
Focused on basic rights.
Correct. This first wave, especially prominent in the UK up to World War I, largely focused on achieving individual rights and freedoms for women within the existing social and political system.
And we saw real results from this, like women getting the vote.
Absolutely. In the British context, the militant campaign for suffrage was central, eventually leading to women over 21 getting the vote in 1928, though full parity took longer. This wave also pushed for access to education, property rights, vital steps forward.
But not full equality.
No, as the source points out, they fell short of achieving full equality across the board, which, paved the way for the second wave.
Often dated from the late 1960s onwards.
Exactly. Popping up first in the USA, quickly gaining steam in the UK by the late 60s, early 70s. The second wave was characterized by the emergence of the women's liberation movement.
And this was more radical.
Much more radical in its critique and demands, calling for nothing less than a wholesale transformation of society, not just tweaking the existing structure. This is the era of consciousness-raising groups, women's collectives becoming widespread.
Places to share experiences, develop ideas.
Crucial spaces for women to share experiences, debate ideas, and collectively theorize about the roots of their oppression. These groups were absolutely instrumental in shaping contemporary feminist thought.
And this second wave especially, it had a huge impact on academia, right? Including criminology.
Massive. Seismic, even. It fundamentally challenged the status quo. For generations, academic disciplines have been dominated by male scholars, male research questions, theories built on male experiences. Feminist scholars came in and demanded change.
And the source describes this challenge as having sort of two main aims.
Yes. Firstly, there was the argument for integrating women into existing theories, pushing for theories to be re-examined, modified, so they could actually account for women's lives, experiences, behavior, instead of just assuming men were the universal standard.
And the second aim.
Secondly, and maybe more fundamentally, there's the argument for developing entirely new theoretical approaches, specifically focused on understanding issues relevant to women, their unique forms of victimization, their pathways into crime or away from it, their experiences with social control.
The overall goal being
To make previously invisible women visible and central in research and theory.
sounds like a necessary correction, but the source notes it wasn't exactly a smooth ride.
Not at all. Feminist work in academia, like the broader movement, faced significant resistance. It was often criticized, dismissed as trivial or biased, sometimes actively undermined by established, male-dominated structures within universities' research institutions.
But despite that resistance,
Despite that, feminist scholarship successfully challenged the dominance of traditional male-centered knowledge paradigms. It established itself as a significant, though often contested, social and political force within academia. It forced disciplines like criminology to confront their biases.
so when we talk about the diversity within contemporary feminism that came out of this period, the source breaks down several key types. Maybe we can quickly touch on each. Because their different starting points affect how they see crime.
Absolutely. It's important to understand these different bases. First up is liberal feminism.
Kind of rooted in those earlier first wave ideas, individual rights, freedoms.
Exactly. Liberal feminism tends to see discrimination primarily located in the public sphere, in laws, institutions, the workplace. Their main strategy for equality is through legal and policy reform.
So things like anti-discrimination laws, equal pay acts.
Precisely. Equal opportunities in education, employment, seeking equality within the existing system. Now, the source acknowledges the value of these efforts. They achieved concrete changes, but it also notes criticisms.
Such as?
That liberal feminism can be superficial sometimes, that it fails to challenge the deeper, more fundamental structures of inequality or the underlying male values often embedded in societal norms and institutions.
Okay. Then you have radical feminism. Seems like a very different animal.
Oh, very different. Radical feminism, really gaining prominence in the 70s, puts patriarchy right at the absolute center of its analysis. They see it as the system of hierarchical control by men over women.
Male power as the fundamental problem.
The institutionalization of male power and domination as the fundamental source of oppression. Their famous slogan, "The personal is political," really underscores their argument that this male power isn't just public. It's deeply pervasive in private life, in relationships, in the family.
So they brought issues like domestic violence out into the open.
Exactly. Reproductive rights, pornography, sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse. Taking them from the private realm into the public political agenda. Some radical feminists, based on this analysis of pervasive male control and potential violence, even advocate for various degrees of separatism from men.
And the main criticisms leveled against radical feminism.
They've faced criticism, particularly regarding potential biological determinism, this idea of an inherent unchanging difference between all men and all women. Also, sometimes criticized for universalizing patriarchy, suggesting it operates identically everywhere all the time, which can sometimes obscure important differences based on class, ethnicity, or history.
Right. Next up, linking oppression more to the economic system, we have Marxist feminism.
Yes, Marxist feminists argue women's subordination is fundamentally rooted in the capitalist system's exploitation of their domestic role.
How so?
They point to how the dominant ideology justifies assigning women to unpaid care work in the family. This makes them economically dependent, vulnerable, and it's used to rationalize low wages, part-time work, lower status if they do enter the paid workforce.
And the reserve army of labor idea.
Yeah, women are seen as a reserve army of labor for capitalism, pulled into the workforce when needed, easily pushed back home, or into unemployment during downturns. While it's been criticized for maybe over-relying on purely economic explanations, not fully capturing family complexities or non-economic power, the source notes it's increasingly relevant as more women have entered the market economy.
Okay. And trying to bridge the gap between the radical focus on patriarchy and the Marxist focus on capitalism.
That's where socialist feminism comes in. It explicitly tries to synthesize the insights of both. Some use a dual systems theory. Capitalism and patriarchy are separate but interacting systems of oppression, reinforcing each other.
Others try to unify them.
Right. Others seek unified systems, looking for overarching concepts like alienation to connect Marxist, radical, even liberal thought. It has the potential for a more comprehensive account, bringing together structural economic factors and gendered power dynamics.
But it also faced criticism.
Yeah, notably from Black feminists, for not always adequately addressing the diverse experiences of women from different racial or ethnic backgrounds.
Which leads us perfectly to the crucial contribution of Black feminism.
Absolutely vital. Black feminism highlights that for many women, oppression isn't just about gender or just class or just race. It's about how these structures of domination intersect.
The matrix of domination.
Exactly. Scholars like bell hooks talk about a matrix of domination or politic of domination experienced by Black women, where race, gender, and class oppressions are interwoven, mutually reinforcing. Black feminists strongly critiqued some white middle-class feminism for often overlooking or failing to understand the unique experiences of Black women and other women of color, whose lives are shaped by racism as well as sexism and classism.
So they really push the conversation towards difference and intersectionality.
Instrumental in opening up that discourse within feminism, acknowledging and centering difference.
And the idea of difference is also central to the last one mentioned, postmodern feminism.
Indeed. Postmodern feminism, influenced by broader postmodern thought, emphasizes the centrality of difference, diversity, the rejection of grand universalizing theories. Carol Smart, whose work we'll discuss more, has been associated with this, viewing the emphasis on difference positively.
That there were concerns.
Yeah, other feminists raised concerns that focusing too heavily on individual difference could potentially undermine the idea of women as a collective group capable of unified political action, contesting male supremacy. It presents a theoretical challenge. How do you hold on to the idea of a shared struggle, women, while also recognizing and valuing the immense diversity among women?
So it's a really rich and varied landscape of thought. As the source sums it up, these different feminisms offer distinct explanations for oppression, propose different solutions, focusing on things like individual rights, patriarchy, capitalism, intersectionality, difference. And it's this diverse set of lenses that feminists brought to bear on criminology.
Which circles right back to that initial fundamental problem, traditional criminology being overwhelmingly malestream and biased.
Right. It wasn't just a neutral science that happened to forget women. Rafter and Heidenson described late 20th century criminology quite pointedly as the most masculine of all the social sciences.
Oof. And the main critique, as Daly and Chesney-Lynn framed it, was about pervasive intellectual sexism baked into the theories themselves, and institutional sexism reflected in the practices and outcomes of the criminal justice system.
Now, the source notes there were earlier voices pointing this out even before feminism really took hold academically. People like Bertrand, Heidenson herself, Klein, even Barbara Wooten way back.
Yes, there were definitely precursors who noted the neglect or the stereotypical distortions when women were discussed. But it was Carol Smart's 1977 book, Women, Crime, and Criminology, that is widely seen as the pivotal turning point. It consolidated those earlier critiques and really set a new agenda.
What did Smart's work do specifically?
It powerfully demonstrated how traditional criminology had not only failed to adequately see women, but worse, when it did acknowledge female crime, it often applied harmful, essentialist sexual stereotypes, rooted in outdated biological or psychological ideas about female nature. Her book was absolutely foundational for developing feminist perspectives within criminology.
And a key early target for feminists was exactly that point, how traditional theories seem stuck in the past, especially using biological or psychological explanations for female crime.
Exactly. While criminology generally was moving towards more sociological, structural explanations for male crime, explanations for female offending often remained fixated on things like hormones, menstruation, psychological deviance linked to sexuality. Heidenson noted this lag.
And this focus carried over into the justice system.
Yeah. As Downes and Rock pointed out, policies and attitudes towards female criminality often mirrored these deterministic ideas, giving undue prominence to sexual deviance when discussing women offenders.
But the deeper problem, identified by feminists like Einstadter and Henry, was even more fundamental, wasn't it? It wasn't just the type of theories, but the theories themselves.
Absolutely. Regardless of the school strain theory, differential association, social bonding, conflict theory, you name it, they were almost exclusively designed to explain male criminality. And they'd only been tested and validated on male populations.
Which logically meant?
They were ill-equipped to adequately explain female criminality. And crucially, they couldn't explain the massive gender differences in crime rates and types that we actually observe empirically. As Leonard noted, no single traditional theory, or even combining them, seemed capable of accounting for this huge gender ratio problem. Why do men commit so much more crime?
Okay, so the initial critique was pretty damning. Traditional theories are male-biased, can't explain female crime or the gender gap. But did any feminist scholar see any potential value in any of these traditional sociological approaches? Or was it a complete write-off?
No, it wasn't a complete write-off for everyone. The source presents a more nuanced view from scholars like Alison Morris. In her 1987 work, she actually offered a counter-argument to the idea that all traditional theories were useless for understanding women.
Okay, how did she approach that? What was her argument?
She argued that while, yes, the biological and purely psychological theories about female crime were rightly critiqued and largely flawed, certain sociological explanations could potentially offer some useful insights into female crime and why it's less frequent than male crime.
But with a big if.
With a crucial caveat. Provided gender is explicitly and properly integrated into the analysis of those theories.
So she wasn't saying the theories were fine as they were, but that if you applied a gender lens, they might actually have some explanatory power for women too.
Precisely. She suggested that explanations for men's and women's crime don't necessarily need to be fundamentally different in their core mechanisms. She found that sociological theories like anomie or strain, differential association, and social bonding could be particularly relevant if applied with sensitivity to gender.
How would that work in practice? Applying a gender lens to, say, social bonding theory?
Well, she proposed that factors like differential opportunity structures, men and women, often have different access to legitimate and illegitimate opportunities, right? Differential associations who men and women typically hang out with and learn from socialization processes, the different ways boys and girls are raised, what's encouraged or discouraged, and the nature of social bonding itself. Attachments to family, school, peers might differ based on gender roles and expectations. All these could help us understand the crimes committed by both men and women.
So by adding gender into the mix of those existing theories,
by explicitly incorporating how gender shapes these factors, she argued, these theories could potentially account for both male and female crime and help explain the differences in the nature and extent between genders.
That's a really interesting attempt to sort of bridge the gap. But despite this more nuanced view from Morris, the source highlights that there's still no single, universally accepted, uniquely feminist explanation that fully cracks those core questions, right? The generalizability question, can one theory explain crime for both sexes? And the gender ratio question, why do men commit so much more crime?
Right. While Morris suggested modifying existing theories, many feminist theorists continue to focus on the dimensions of gender and sex roles and the underlying patriarchal structures, arguing these were the crucial fundamental elements that traditional theories either completely ignored or fundamentally misunderstood in their original formulation.
So people like Chesney Lynn emphasize that the key contribution was highlighting how these structures shape the whole context.
Exactly. The context within which crime occurs and is responded to.
And this feminist analysis, it goes beyond just explaining who commits crime or who gets victimized. It also critically looks at how the agencies of social control themselves police, courts operate within this gendered, often patriarchal framework.
Precisely. Feminist perspectives scrutinize how these institutions can actively reinforce traditional gender roles, women's subordinate place in society, and male dominance, sometimes through overt discrimination, sometimes through more subtle biases baked into procedures and attitudes.
Okay, so let's talk about the real-world impact then. Beyond the theory, where have feminist perspectives actually led to changes or, really heated debates within criminology and the justice system?
Well, a major and perhaps the most tangible area of influence has been enforcing criminology in the criminal justice system to pay serious attention to crimes committed against women by men.
Things that were previously ignored or trivialized.
Exactly. Often seen as private matters outside the scope of criminal justice entirely.
Like rape and domestic violence, which are now, thankfully, central topics of study and policy concern.
Precisely. Feminism has been absolutely instrumental in bringing these issues out of the shadows. Feminist campaigning and research have led to significant changes in how these crimes are handled,
Like what kind of changes?
pushing for things like greater anonymity and protection for rape survivors in court proceedings. Though the source notes, via Adler, that the practical implementation can still be inconsistent or limited. We've also seen the development of specialist police units, dedicated interview suites designed to handle sexual assault cases more sensitively.
And these efforts, they've led to more reporting, presumably, though maybe still not enough.
Some increase, yes, but the source makes the critical point that the actual incidence of crimes like rape and domestic violence is still vastly higher than official statistics indicate. Huge underreporting still exists.
And domestic violence specifically?
It's now generally taken more seriously by the CJS than it was decades ago. There are special legal provisions aimed at protecting women and children experiencing abuse. However,
There's a but.
yeah, the source mentions a debate about whether treating domestic violence cases differently from other forms of assault might inadvertently lead to them being handled less seriously by some parts of the system compared to similar violence happening in public spaces.
Yeah.
And despite all the awareness and legal changes, domestic violence remains one of the least reported crimes globally. Still massively hidden.
Okay. Beyond these specific issues, the source identifies a broader sort of threefold influence that the feminist focus on studying women and their experiences has had on criminology overall.
Right. Firstly, it has, as we discussed, prompted the development of distinct explanations, specifically focused on female criminality and conformity. Why do women offend? And maybe even more compellingly, why do so few women offend compared to men?
Makes sense. What's the second influence?
Secondly, it's led to the gendering of crime analysis more generally. This isn't just about understanding female crime through a gender lens, but also recognizing that male criminality, too, needs to be understood through the lens of male gender roles and masculinities. It means acknowledging that explanations for men's behavior can also be subject to gender stereotypes, a point we'll definitely come back to when we discuss masculinity later.
Okay, and the third broader influence.
And thirdly, and this is really important, it is highlighted that women often have a significantly distinct experience of crime itself as victims, as offenders, and in navigating the criminal justice system compared to men.
And this recognition has influenced other theories.
Yes, it has influenced perspectives like left realism, particularly its emphasis on conducting victim studies to understand the real impact of crime on communities and individuals. Though it's worth noting, feminist perspectives might differ on exactly how that victim data should be interpreted or used.
So the impact is pretty broad. And Downs and Rock, who are mentioned in the source, they summarized 3 specific areas where feminist critique made major theoretical contributions. Let's dig into those. The first one is that controversial female emancipation leads to crime debate.
Ah, yes. This was a really prominent and often quite sensationalized debate back in the mid-1970s. Scholars like Frida Adler, with her book Sisters in Crime in '75, and Rita Simon, with The Contemporary Woman in Crime, also '75, they argued they were seeing increases in female crime rates.
Particularly in certain areas.
Yeah, particularly in things like aggression and property crime, which they linked directly to the gains being made by the women's liberation movement.
Okay, how did Adler frame that link? What was her specific argument?
Adler's core idea was basically that men and women had a similar inherent potential for criminality, but past differences in crime rates were mainly due to the different sex roles society imposed. So as women's roles changed in the legitimate sphere through liberation, more education joining the workforce, their involvement in the illegitimate sphere, crime, also changed.
Because they had new opportunities.
Exactly. They were gaining access to new, previously male-dominated criminal opportunities, leading to greater participation in crimes like robbery and violence, according to her.
And Rita Simon's take, was it the same?
Slightly different emphasis. Simon agreed that emancipation led to increased female crime, but she argued it primarily provided increased opportunities for women to commit certain types of crime, especially financial and property crimes, because they were now in positions in the workplace, for example, where they had access to money and resources previously restricted to men.
But she differed on violence.
Yes, unlike Adler, Simon actually argued that emancipation would make women less violent over time because their frustration levels would decrease as they gained more equality. So while both linked liberation and crime, their proposed mechanisms and predictions about the type of crime differed quite a bit.
It sounds sort of plausible on the surface, doesn't it? As opportunities expand, so do criminal ones. But the source points out this argument faced pretty substantial criticism.
Oh, significant criticism. Many critics, like Box and Hale, argued that the observed increase in female crime was actually relatively small, and that the link between emancipation and crime was primarily just an historical overlap in timing, not a direct causal relationship. They really dug into the data.
And what did the data actually show? Did it support Adler or Simon?
Not really. McJerky and Fitzgerald, for instance, show that male violent crime rates actually continued to rise faster than female rates during that period, which kind of undercut the whole new violent female narrative. Box himself dismissed the idea of a radical emergence of a new violent female criminal as largely a myth, not supported by the evidence.
And other studies.
Walklate's analyses consistently showed that women generally commit similar types of crime as men, but at vastly lower rates and significantly less serious levels. Heidenson's empirical work demonstrated that women's offending remained, and largely still remains, concentrated in specific areas like minor theft, handling stolen goods, drug offenses, relatively little involvement in serious violence compared to men.
What about age patterns?
And longitudinal studies, like those by Graham and Bowling, showed female offending tended to peak at an earlier age, maybe 13, 14, compared to males. Again, suggesting different patterns than a simple convergence due to adult emancipation.
So the strong causal link between liberation and a massive crime wave among women was largely debunked.
Largely, yes. While a simple cause and effect relationship between liberation and a radical shift in the nature or rate of female serious crime was never convincingly demonstrated. The source does offer a sort of concluding thought on this debate.
Which is?
It acknowledges that the argument that maybe reduced informal social controls on girls and young women, possibly related to changing societal expectations influenced by feminism, might provide some new opportunities for involvement in previously less likely criminal activities. Well, that could hold some partial truth, but it's a far, far cry from the sweeping claims of a new violent female army competing with men.
Okay, so that debate was largely put to rest by empirical critique. The second contribution Downs and Rock highlight is the invalidation of the leniency hypothesis.
This is another really significant one. The leniency hypothesis originated with the criminologist Otto Pollack way back in 1950.
What was his idea?
He proposed that women were often treated more leniently by the criminal justice system, police, judges, juries, compared to men who committed similar offenses. His explanation for this was rooted in a notion of chivalry among the mostly male actors in the system, who were supposedly unwilling to treat women harshly. He also, quite controversially, suggested female crime was more hidden, rooted in deceit linked to female nature.
But feminist research really took issue with this chivalry idea.
Absolutely. Feminist scholars critically examined the data, the processes within the CJS, and found the picture was much more complex, and often actually the opposite of leniency.
How so? What did they find?
Studies, like the classic one by Farrington and Morris, look closely at sentencing decisions. They found that when you control for factors like prior criminal record, how serious the offense was, other legally relevant variables, that apparent leniency towards women often just disappeared.
So it wasn't chivalry.
Not necessarily. It was often simply that women, on average, had less serious criminal histories or committed less serious offenses in the first place. It looked like leniency, but it wasn't really about gender bias in that direction.
And other research highlighted ways women were actually treated more harshly or judged based on gender roles.
Exactly. Pat Carlin's powerful work in Scotland, for example, found judges were sometimes more likely to imprison women, not just for the crime itself, but if they felt the woman had failed in her expected roles as a mother or homemaker.
So punishment was tied to conforming to gender roles.
It suggests punishment was tied to gender role expectations and social control, rather than leniency based on chivalry. Women who deviated from prescribed norms could be judged really harshly.
So the conclusion from Downs and Rock, drawing on all this feminist research, is quite stark then. It completely flips Pollack's idea.
It really does. They concluded that rather than being treated leniently by the courts due to chivalry, women are often actually underprotected by the system when they are victims of crime, especially domestic or sexual violence, and over-controlled by the courts when they are offenders. particularly if their behavior is seen as deviating from gender norms or if they're perceived to be failing in traditional roles. This fundamentally turns the leniency hypothesis on its head.
That's a powerful reversal. Okay, the third specific contribution they mention is the emergence of gender-based theories.
Right. This involves either taking existing general theories and explicitly modifying them to incorporate gender dynamics, or developing entirely new theoretical frameworks specifically built around understanding gender and crime. A key area where existing theory was adapted was control theory, like Hushi's social bonding theory.
And this adaptation was often used to explain that gender ratio, again, why female crime rates are so low compared to men's.
Precisely. Instead of just assuming low female crime rates are natural, scholars asked why. Frances Heidenson, in her hugely influential 1985 book Women in Crime, argued powerfully that the primary reason there are relatively few women criminals is the extensive web of formal and informal controls that constrain women within a male-dominated society.
Controls?
Yeah.
How did she describe those controls functioning? What do they look like?
She really delved into the specifics of how these controls operate. A major mechanism is the practical and ideological constraints imposed by traditional familial roles and expectations placed on women.
Like being the main caregiver.
Like being the primary caregiver, the homemaker. These roles effectively limit women's time and opportunities to engage in activities outside the home, including criminal ones. They function to push women back into the domestic sphere, where they are subject to greater levels of surveillance and control.
So the home, often seen as a private haven, can actually be a site of control for women.
Absolutely. Heidenson points out the paradox. Women are often assigned responsibility for controlling others within the home or community, like a mother instilling discipline, sometimes referencing the father's authority. But in doing so, they are simultaneously acting as agents of male authority while also being controlled themselves, both within the home and by societal expectations outside it.
This links back to that idea of separate spheres, doesn't it? Public for men, private for women.
Yes, the traditional sexual division of labor posits a public sphere primarily for men, work, politics, etc., and a private sphere, the home, primarily for women. Heidenson argues women are expected to function predominantly within that private domestic realm.
And what are the consequences of being mainly confined to that private sphere, according to her analysis?
Well, while it might offer some perceived security or autonomy, the privacy of the home can also lead to isolation, dependence, and oppression. It makes women vulnerable, can subtly undermine their confidence and self-esteem through constant evaluation of their domestic performance.
And it can lead to violence.
And, as powerfully documented by Dobash and Dobash's work on wife beating, it can escalate to overt violence and physical harm within those private walls. Studies like Brown and Harris's work on depression also linked being housebound, isolated, dependent within the domestic sphere to higher rates of neurosis and depression among women.
So Heidenson's core argument is that between the constraints of roles, the control within the home, the expectations of society, women's socialization and existence conditions effectively control them, limiting both the opportunity and maybe the propensity for criminal activity, thus explaining the low rates compared to men.
Precisely. It's a powerful application of control theory from a feminist perspective, seeing pervasive societal control, largely linked to gender roles and patriarchy, as the key factor in explaining female conformity.
And an example often discussed in this context where women are involved but the dynamics of control are paramount is prostitution.
Yes, prostitution is a really interesting case study here, and the source examines how different feminist perspectives view it, challenging those older, more traditional views.
What were those traditional views like?
Historically, traditional views, like Kingsley Davis's structural functionalist perspective, often framed prostitution as almost a necessary social institution, an inevitable, maybe undesirable consequence of sexual repression in society. It wasn't really seen as a major criminological issue, and certainly not through a gendered lens of exploitation or power.
But the different feminist perspectives break sharply from that, don't they?
Oh, starkly different analyses.
Yeah.
Take liberal feminists first. Perhaps surprisingly to some, their focus is often on individual choice and agency.
Choice in relation to prostitution.
They might view prostitution as a choice made by women, potentially even offering a form of liberation, maybe economic independence, though often precarious, or sexual autonomy outside traditional relationships. They often frame it as a consensual contract between adults, like other professional services.
So their critique is more about the legal system.
Often, yes. Their view, influenced by liberal ideals like John Stuart Mill's focus on personal rights, is that much of the violence and exploitation experienced by prostitutes isn't inherent to the transaction itself, but is exacerbated by the current legal system which criminalizes, stigmatizes, marginalizes sex workers. Their critique is aimed at legal and gender role injustices, not necessarily a moral condemnation of the act itself. They often focus on decriminalization and rights.
Okay. Then you have the Marxist feminist view. What's their take?
For them, poverty is the overwhelmingly crucial motivator. They see entering prostitution as a rational, albeit difficult, choice made by women facing extreme economic hardship and misery under capitalism, especially given the constraints of traditional marriage or limited employment options.
So it's a form of labor under capitalism.
Bonger, from a Marxist perspective, saw prostitution as a corrupt form of labor, a stark symbol of capitalist exploitation. Marx himself linked it to the general prostitution of the laborer within capitalism. Prostitutes are viewed primarily as oppressed workers within an exploitative system. Interestingly, the source notes Carol Pateman, a Marxist feminist, who seems to align somewhat with the liberal view,
How so?
arguing that prostitutes are independent contractors and that the contract itself doesn't harm their body or self, suggesting capitalism's impact is more on their spiritual or human essence rather than physical harm through the contract, which is maybe a bit counterintuitive for a Marxist view focused on exploitation of the body and labor.
Yeah, highlights the diversity even within strands. But radical feminists, they have perhaps the most widely known and very stark critique of prostitution.
They certainly do. They see it fundamentally as a product of patriarchal society, structured entirely by unequal power relations between men and women. For them, it's clear evidence of the sexual and economic oppression and exploitation of all women by men, not just those directly involved.
So definitely not a choice, but a result of systemic oppression.
Precisely. They view it as inherently exploitative. Women being exploited by pimps, by clients who purchase access to women's bodies, sometimes even by official agencies. Radical feminism is really key in shifting the focus of analysis away from the prostitute's sexuality, which traditional views obsessed over, and onto the sexuality and psychology of the men involved with the clients, as Edwards noted.
And they definitely wouldn't see it as a victimless crime.
Absolutely not.
Right.
Radical feminists adamantly argue it is not victimless and that it fundamentally reinforces and perpetuates the objectification, subordination, and exploitation of women, as argued by Weisberg.
And they challenge male myths about sexuality.
Furthermore, yes, they directly challenge what they view as pervasive male myths used to justify demand for prostitution and pornography myths that men inherently need more sex than women or are biologically driven to dominance. Radical feminists see these as cultural constructs, not biological imperatives.
So prostitution reinforces harmful ideas.
In this view, prostitution and pornography are deeply harmful because they exacerbate men's self-serving belief in the primacy of their sexuality and dominance. They reinforce a dangerous fantasy of women as weak, submissive objects available for male use. And this, according to Weisberg, hinders women's collective efforts to affect new attitudes about gender and achieve genuine self-realization.
Wow. That's a powerful contrast in perspectives. It really shows how different feminist lenses can look at the same phenomenon, prostitution, and come to vastly different conclusions about its nature, its causes, its consequences. Which kind of brings us to a big question. Does all this work, all these critiques and perspectives, mean there's now a distinct feminist criminology, like a separate field?
That's actually been a significant debate within feminist scholarship in criminology itself. Some writers, like Brown, have argued for the existence of a separate, identifiable feminist criminology. But others,
We're more cautious.
including Carol Smart in her earlier work, were more cautious, feeling that while feminist perspectives were crucial within criminology, a few scholars identifying as feminists didn't necessarily constitute a wholly separate academic discipline.
And Pat Carlin, according to the source, she had specific criticisms about even trying to create a separate feminist criminology.
She did. She raised two main points. Firstly, somewhat ironically given the origins, she suggested that by focusing so heavily on female crime, some feminist analyses actually, perhaps unintentionally, reinforce the traditional criminological idea that crime is primarily a male problem, thus kind of marginalizing women within the broader study of crime again.
And her second point.
Secondly, she felt that any attempts to create a single universal feminist explanation of crime that could apply equally to both men and women were theoretically unsound, given the diverse nature of crime and social experience. Just too simplistic.
Other feminist scholars seem to agree that the analysis should be central, but maybe not separate, like Heidenson.
Yes, Heidenson, for instance, argued that feminist analysis should be absolutely central to the study of women, crime, and social control. But that didn't necessarily mean it needed to be ghettoized into a separate feminist criminology discipline, distinct from the main body of criminology. Alison Morris also agreed, pointing out the inherent diversity within both feminism itself and the broader field of criminology makes the idea of a unified, singular feminist criminology discipline questionable. Gelsthorpe and Morris felt it was more accurate and useful to speak of feminist perspectives within criminology, influencing the field from within.
And the postmodern feminist perspective we talked about earlier, with its focus on difference, would likely align with this hesitation about creating one single discipline.
Well, absolutely. A postmodern feminist perspective would naturally be wary of any attempt to create an all-encompassing feminist theory or discipline that claims to provide a universal account of all women's experiences or all crime phenomena. They'd emphasize fragmentation and diversity.
So it seems the consensus kind of leans towards feminist perspectives influencing criminology, rather than a completely separate field.
That seems to be the stronger position articulated in the source, yes. However, Carol Smart took this debate even further. In a highly influential article from 1990, she argued that feminism had actually transgressed or moved decisively beyond criminology altogether.
Moved beyond criminology. What did she mean by that? That sounds pretty radical.
It was. Smart contrasted what she saw as the positive, dynamic, and fundamentally emancipatory advances occurring within broader feminist thought and scholarship, with the perceived limited horizons and theoretical constraints of criminology as a discipline.
So she saw criminology as lagging behind.
Her argument was that the core enterprise of criminology itself was fundamentally problematic, often stuck in outdated positivist paradigms focused on narrow questions. She suggested that feminist engagement, while initially seen as transformative, had ultimately only served to revitalize a flawed enterprise rather than creating something genuinely new and better for feminism.
So she felt feminism had actually gained very little from engaging with criminology.
Precisely. She specifically critiqued criminology's continued adherence to positivism, the idea that crime can be studied objectively, scientifically, to find causes and its relative isolation from the major theoretical, philosophical, and political questions engaging feminist scholarship in other fields.
And she famously reframed the question.
Yes. Instead of asking, what does feminism have to contribute to criminology, she asked, what has criminology got to offer feminism? Her stark conclusion, as presented in the source, was that, in her view, criminology actually had very little of value to offer feminism in its broader project of understanding and challenging women's oppression.
Wow. That's a pretty critical assessment of the field she'd spent years influencing. But despite Smart's powerful argument for transgression, the source points out that gender issues have undeniably had a lasting and broadening impact on criminology, and not just in how we study female crime.
That's the key counterpoint, isn't it? Even if you don't believe a separate feminist criminology exists, or you don't fully agree with Smart's idea of transgression, the incorporation of gender issues prompted by feminism has opened up entirely new areas of inquiry within criminology.
So it did change the field.
While certainly enhancing our understanding of female criminality and victimization, feminist insights have also been crucial in prompting criminology to seriously examine masculinity, male power, and male violence through a gendered lens.
And even Carlin, despite her criticisms of a separate feminist criminology, she recognized the benefits of a feminist perspective.
Yes, even she acknowledged the significant positive impact of feminist work for understanding women, law, and order. She saw women's crimes, particularly those committed by working-class women, as often being the crimes of the powerless, a perspective deeply informed by feminist and socialist analyses. And she recognized the significant influence feminist perspectives have had on campaigns for victims' rights and on theoretical developments like left realism.
This really brings us neatly to that final major shift prompted by feminism, the emergence of masculinities as a serious central topic within criminological theory.
This is arguably one of the most profound long-term impacts. Maureen Kane, another key figure, picking up on themes of transgression and the limits of traditional criminology, posed a fundamental question that really redirected focus.
Which was?
If crime is overwhelmingly a male phenomenon, what is it specifically about maleness, or the social construction of being male, that leads disproportionately to criminal behavior? This seemingly simple question spurred a whole new body of literature dedicated to taking masculinity seriously in crime studies.
And a central figure in that development, mentioned in the source, is Bob Connell.
Bob Connell is crucial. He responded to what he saw as a sometimes one-dimensional or overly simplistic view of male dominance, presented by some earlier radical feminists, by introducing the sophisticated concept of multiple masculinities.
Multiple masculinities. What does that mean exactly? Not just one way of being a man.
Exactly. It challenges the idea that there is one single, fixed, universal way of being male. Connell argued that masculinity isn't monolithic. There are diverse forms of masculinity that vary significantly based on factors like race, class, sexuality, age, culture.
And they change.
Furthermore, these masculinities are not static. They are socially constructed and subject to challenge and change over time. While he acknowledged that within any given society there might be a dominant or hegemonic form of masculinity, often associated with heterosexual, white, middle-class power and authority, he stressed that male power is not absolute or uniform across all men. It's historically variable and critically socially constructed, not purely a biological outcome of being male.
And how did James Messerschmitt apply these ideas specifically to crime?
Messerschmitt took Connell's concept of multiple masculinities and applied it specifically to understanding male youth crime. He argued that different types of offenses committed by young males are patterned by different interpretations and performances of masculinity.
Performances of masculinity.
Yes, and these interpretations are themselves shaped by the broader social structures of class and race that the young men inhabit.
So crime becomes a way of performing masculinity, a way of being male.
Exactly. Echoing themes you might find in strain or enemy theory, Messerschmitt proposed that crime becomes a means of doing masculinity, of achieving, asserting, or performing a particular version of masculinity, especially when young men lack access to other, more legitimate resources or opportunities to achieve the dominant masculine ideal.
Like what kind of resources?
Like a high-paying job, educational success, being the traditional family provider, things like that. When those are blocked, crime can become a resource. And the specific type of crime committed varies depending on how different class and ethnic groups define and perform their masculinity within their specific social context.
Can you give an example from Messerschmitt's work?
Sure. He examined different groups. For instance, he argued that white working-class youth might construct masculinity around physical aggression and toughness in public spaces like bars or on the street, places where they feel they can exert control that's denied to them elsewhere, like school or the job market.
And for other groups?
Lower working-class ethnic minority youth, he argued, might find a sense of toughness, respect, and physical power by engaging in street gangs and offenses like robbery. Again, as a way of achieving a form of masculinity that is blocked by structures of race and class elsewhere. These criminal acts are attempts to achieve or demonstrate masculine competence and identity when other avenues are unavailable or feel inaccessible.
That makes a lot of sense. Crime is a resource for performing identity when other resources are scarce. But the source mentions criticisms of Messerschmitt's approach, too.
Yes. Critics like Jefferson have argued that while the link between masculinity and crime is compelling, Messerschmitt's approach can sometimes appear a bit structurally deterministic.
Meaning it doesn't explain everything?
It doesn't fully explain why, for example, only a minority of young men from these specific class or ethnic groups actually choose to do masculinity through crime, while the majority do not, despite facing similar structural barriers. There must be other factors at play beyond just structural constraints and the need to perform masculinity.
And adding another layer to understanding the motivation, scholars like Katz and Presdy, often associated with cultural criminology, they bring in the element of pleasure, right?
This is really important because traditional criminology often focuses on deficits or pathology. Katz, in particular, in his work on the seductions of crime, highlights that criminology has largely failed to recognize and theorize the pleasure, the excitement, the sense of accomplishment involved in doing masculinity through crime.
The thrill of it.
The thrill, the defiance, the feeling of power gained through certain criminal acts, particularly for young people. That can be a crucial part of the motivation and needs to be understood as part of how identity, including gender identity, is performed. It's not just about lack, it's also about gain, even if it's illicit gain or feeling.
Okay. This focus on masculinity as a social construction, something that is performed rather than just a biological state, that has a logical implication that really challenges traditional binaries, doesn't it? Male, female, masculinity, femininity.
It absolutely does. If masculinity is a social construction that can be performed and is not tied purely to biological sex, then the traditional male-female gender duality, where masculinity belongs solely to men and femininity solely to women, is revealed as an artificial construct, not fixed in nature.
And the provocative idea then arises. that women can potentially do masculinity as well.
According to Connell's logic, yes. If masculinity is a social performance, then it's conceptually possible for individuals of any biological sex to perform it. And if that's true,
Then criminology needs to look at female crime differently, too.
then contemporary criminology needs to broaden its analysis to understand how crime and violence committed by women and girls might relate to these performances of masculinities, or aspects of masculinities.
And Messerschmitt himself addressed this later on.
He did. In 2005, Messerschmitt argued that both traditional pre-feminist criminology and even some strands of liberal feminism inadvertently created an artificial dualism by rigidly linking masculinity only to men and femininity only to women, effectively reifying these gender roles as biological destiny rather than social performance.
So for contemporary criminology, the task isn't just about studying the differences between men and women's crime.
Exactly. Messerschmitt's conclusion for the field is that the goal isn't simply to focus on the differences between male and female crime rates or types, because that can reinforce those rigid gender binaries. Instead, the task is to examine and explain both gender differences and similarities in crime commission.
How? By focusing on what he calls
By focusing on what he terms gender diversity.
gender diversity in crime. What does that mean?
It means studying crime as potentially related to the performance and negotiation of diverse gender constructions, including masculinities and femininities, by individuals of any biological sex. It involves identifying and examining the possible forms of masculinities performed by women and girls, and conversely, femininities performed by men and boys, and understanding their potential link to crime.
Jody Miller's work on girls in gangs seems like a good example here, mentioned in the source.
It is. Miller's research shows how some girls in gangs actively identify as one of the guys and describe their gang activities as masculinist enterprises. They engage in behaviors typically associated with male gangs and male offenders.
But it sounds like it's still complex, not a simple switch.
Oh, it is. Miller notes that even in these mixed gender or self-described masculinist gangs, traditional gender inequality often persists. Identifying as one of the guys might be more about differentiating themselves from other girls who they see as weak or conforming than about achieving genuine equality or being treated exactly like the boys in the gang. It's a negotiation of identity within existing power structures.
And Messerschmitt's own study of violent girls confirmed some of this, that girls can do masculinity.
Yes, his 2004 study showed how some violent girls actively do masculinity through displays of physical toughness, aggression, and a deliberate rejection of traditional femininity. These performances are often rooted in their specific class and racial locations and the opportunities or constraints they face.
So the final takeaway from Messerschmitt in the source, leading into this idea of gender diversity in crime, is
The conclusion is that contemporary criminology needs to move beyond simply documenting gender differences. It needs to study how gender is actively constructed and performed by all people across the spectrum of masculinities and femininities, and how these performances, shaped by intersecting social structures, are linked to engagement in crime for people of all genders.
wow. Okay, so we've taken quite a journey today, haven't we? We started by exposing that fundamental critique of criminology's blind spots, its malestream bias.
Yeah, where women were just invisible or stereotyped.
Then we navigated the rich and diverse landscape of feminist thought, liberal, radical, Marxist, socialist, Black, postmodern, seeing how different perspectives view oppression and inequality.
And how those different views led to different analyses of crime.
We saw how these perspectives reshaped research on female offending and victimization, challenged those old, flawed assumptions like the leniency hypothesis and that simple emancipation crime link.
And pushed ignored issues like domestic violence right to the forefront where they belong.
And crucially, we've seen how feminism didn't just add women into the picture. It fundamentally questioned the very framework and led to a critical examination of masculinity itself.
Absolutely. Forcing criminology to grapple with the social construction and performance of gender.
Yeah.
Prompting this fascinating shift toward understanding how masculinities and even femininities are done in relation to crime, potentially by people of any biological sex.
It's clear that feminist perspectives haven't just been an addition to criminology. They've been a truly transformative force, challenging assumptions, demanding attention to previously invisible issues, and opening up entirely new and crucial ways of understanding crime and justice for everyone, not just women.
Absolutely. The field is undeniably much richer, more nuanced, more critical because of these critiques and contributions. Still evolving, of course.
Definitely. So to leave you, our listener, with a thought based on the material we've covered today, Consider how this idea of masculinity as a social performance, something that is actively done and varies based on social context, rather than simply being inherent to male biology. How does that change how you might think about crime?
Especially crimes typically associated with men, like violent crime or acquisitive crime.
Yeah. If crime is a way of doing gender, what does that imply about motivations? And does this idea of gender diversity in crime commission, the potential for people across the gender spectrum to engage in crime as a performance of aspects of masculinity or femininity, what does that mean for the future of crime research? And even how we approach crime prevention and policy, it's a lot to ponder.
It certainly is a complex but absolutely essential area that continues to evolve and challenge us.